Hi, Paul, and good afternoon, everybody online. I can't see you, but I know that there are many of you there, and you're very welcome to join us in one of our a seminar in one of our series, our Evidence for Policy seminar series. And we're trying to stimulate debate, discussion, hopefully not rouse reflection on this topic, this much talked about topic of evidence informed policy making or evidence for policy, but which we're all trying to grapple with. And this is all the seminar series being produced by the HRB is really in service in terms of building up to a flagship conference that we have later on this year. Keep the date in your diary, the 3rd of December, where our conference will focus on how to advance evidence-informed policy making. And so keep an eye on our webpage and on our social media sites because there are a series of podcasts, webinars, blogs, and videos, as well as what you're joining here today in the lead up to that event later on in the year. I'm very aware, looking at the list just before I joined, that we have a lot of people from outside of Ireland, and we have a very mixed audience in terms of researchers, those working with charities and philanthropy, policymakers, people from funders, etc. So that's just to give Paul the heads up and also to say, I usually start these events by saying, look, everybody is familiar with the Health Research Board, but just in case you're not, we are the lead agency with responsibility for funding health and social care research in Ireland, a budget of about 60 million a year, which we get from our Ministry from Health. And we have, like most funders, a whole range of schemes to fund people, projects, and initiatives in patient focused research, health services systems policy research and population health research. So for those of you who are new to our screens, you're very welcome today. This webinar is live, but it will also be available afterwards if you want to say it to your other colleagues on the HRB YouTube page. For those of you who are live, you have a chance to ask questions to our speaker here today. Details are in the chat on the link to Slido, but also the code to get into Slido. So you will find those in the chat, if at all possible, because I will be looking at Slido throughout in terms of framing the questions later on. I will throw an eye into the chat every now and then, but I'd really encourage you maybe not to put your questions or your comments into the chat and to stick them into Slido instead. And finally, in terms of housekeeping, just to say live captions are also enabled if anybody wishes to use those for the seminar, the webinar today. Without further ado, I'm going to introduce you to our esteemed speaker today, Paul Cairney. As he clarified for me yesterday, yes, this is going out to many people in Ireland, but it's not Carney, it's Cairney. And Paul is Professor of Politics and Public Policy from the University of Stirling in Scotland. His interests are in the area of comparative public policy, policy analysis and theories, and mostly applied, but probably not exclusively, to UK and devolved government policy. And he's become over decades, I think, probably at this stage, I was going to say years, really interested and reflecting on the issue of evidence, use of evidence in policy making. And Paul is going to talk to us today on the topic of inconvenient truths, the reality of engaging with policymakers. Just by way of an introduction, and he'll go through. I'm not even going to start to give you a flavour for what he's going to talk about, but hand directly over to Paul himself. Paul, if you want to talk for 20 minutes approximately, obviously, if we're still here half an hour later, I might come back on screen and jump in and start bringing us into questions. And then I'm going to be keeping an eye on the questions coming through Slido, and we'll hope to get through as many of them as possible before we aim to close at about 1 o'clock. So without further ado, Paul, I'll hand over to yourself.
Super, thank you. I think that I've prepared quite a short presentation. I know academics say that and then they kind of really drone on, but I think this one should be okay. Let's see. Okay, so I really leaned into the title here. So normally I would do a talk that was something along the lines of why won't policymakers listen to your evidence, that sort of thing. But we've gone full inconvenient truths here. I checked that Al Gore is still with us before I took his image just in case it was in bad taste. Okay, but that's who I associate that phrase with Al Gore. So we're repurposing it for knowledge and policy. I should say I quite like the idea that you'll have a more important conference later where you'll get into solutions, right? So I can just raise all sorts of problems and then leave, look at my watch at 1 o'clock, and there's all these questions. So in times when we had more in-person meetings, I would try and make this kind of the start of the talk a bit more interactive, and just ask people in the audience these four questions, just to gauge what they thought evidence-informed or evidence-based policymaking means, and if they want it. So it's partly a perspective thing in terms of so I have studied this topic for some time now, but it was only maybe in the mid 2010s that it occurred to me that people would want such a thing as evidence-based policymaking. And so I think if you engage in certain fields, it's almost taken for granted as an aim. So I think if you whatever perspective you come from, the first thing you might start with is if you want evidence-based or evidence-informed policymaking, what exactly is evidence that would be the thing that you would base policy on? So, the first question would be, what is good evidence and how do you gather it? Now, I think the interesting thing for me is if I were to ask a group of people that question in another setting, like if I would teach, sometimes I'd give a guest talk on research methods, master's level research methods, and I say, okay, what is good evidence? And I'm kind of expecting someone to say, it derives from methods, and the best methods are randomized controlled trials, and then everything else is trying to live up to them. And then there's the systematic review of randomized controlled trials, which is the one that you build your career on. Then, if you have people in the room who are, say, from disciplines outside of health science, sometimes they'll try and invert that, hierarchy of evidence pyramid. And they'll say, actually, in areas like social work, every situation is complex, and therefore this is much more about individual knowledge and judgment rather than trial-based evidence. So I think you can also have quite bland discussions about what people think of as good evidence in terms of things like, the article is peer-reviewed, for example, or it's in a recognized journal, or people have some other reason to trust it. And I think the kind of overall point there is, I think when you read stuff that bemoans a lack of evidence-based policymaking, it often has a very fixed idea of what evidence is. But when you ask people simply to reflect on what is good evidence, they're much less certain. I think much more open to the sense that there are lots of ways to gather good evidence, or there are lots of reasons to question what good means in this context. Then the second question we might go on to is, what other knowledge is policy relevant? So that brings in this sense that as soon as you move simply from research to research for policy, you think, well, there are lots of other sources of information that might be relevant to policymakers. And that can be things like, survey evidence, or it can be feedback from stakeholders. It can be feedback from service users. It can be, interest group information and lobbying and that sort of thing. So there's a much wider source of inputs to that policy process. And I think if you spend enough time in the study of evidence and policy, you encounter, I think, increasingly frequency, the idea that research evidence should not simply win the day because it can come at the expense of knowledge from recognized, marginalized social groups. So I think in some countries in particular, there's much more debate about, the role of, so-called indigenous knowledge and how, elite scientific research may be accepted at the expense of that knowledge. So I think there's increasing debates about the legitimacy of lots of other forms of knowledge when we're talking about, a just policy process as well as evidence production. Now, I think as soon as you accept that there are many different kinds of knowledge from different sources, I think it's impossible to come up with an answer to the third question, which is how do you put it all together to make something evidence informed? I think you can only do that if you accept that there is one source of evidence with the same metric. As soon as you introduce the idea there are lots of relevant sources of information, there is no metric to combine them. And in fact, it's rare to see a government say how it tries to put everything together in a recognized method. The closest I've seen is in when I looked through some evidence from a senior minister in the Scottish government on how he put together all the COVID relevant evidence, and he essentially said, "I used my judgment." Ministerial judgment was the answer. No, so I quite like that as an answer because it's honest. But if you don't like it, I think that there's an onus on us to try and think of what other method would you see as legitimate to put all those things together. And then the final, nice and philosophical, I shortened this question to make it more philosophical. What is your purpose? That could be a purpose in life, I guess. But really, what in group work, what I'm trying to gauge is the extent to which people who primarily do research, the extent to which they see themselves as involved in politics or somehow independent of it. So I think often the image that people project of scientists is that they are independent of government, independent of policymakers, to the extent that they only provide information and then they don't help policymakers do anything with it. Whereas I think others see themselves as much more invested in trying to influence policy, which requires much more engagement, much more investment in relationships, and therefore a reduced ability to separate yourself as a researcher from the political process. So I think if you don't look at, so again, I'm comfortable with this because I studied political science and everything is political. So therefore, I see myself as a political actor just by default. But I think it's a much more of a challenge to the identity of people who see themselves as, an independent scientists that's somehow not political. So I think if someone says, I just do research, I'm not political, I'm highly skeptical of their position, and I wonder if it's a political statement. Because I mean, as an aside, I reckon one of the best things a senior scientist can do is simply pretend that they are naive about politics and say, I'm just here to give you the great science. Maybe this is the most effective strategic position. Okay. But onto the so-called truths. I think I came up with 5. I can give you more if you like. But the first one it's a segue from that last slide then. No one really agrees on what evidence-based or evidence-informed means. No one agrees on what is good evidence. Some people will say that they know what good evidence is, but I think politics is about power and negotiation. It's not about one group asserting what they think should win out. And this third one is interesting for me. It's quite rare for researchers to try and find out what information or evidence would be useful to policymakers. I think that's the role increasingly of large organizations that are intermediaries between researchers and policymakers. And I think governments are increasingly interested in trying to establish broad parameters to interest research. But I think it's still striking that there is such a disconnect between what researchers and policymakers think they're trying to do in the name of evidence-informed policymakers. So sometimes I'll simply set up some interviews that I'm doing just now with some policymakers, and I say, where do you get your information? What would it take for you to read research evidence? And I think by and large, it would take a remarkable amount of change in a political system for them to read anything that researchers produced. They would get their information from other people who are doing that work for them, or they would be getting the research, via government, something like that. So it's a very interesting first step to just try and work out what we think policymakers would find useful when we're trying to produce research that we think might be policy relevant. Okay. I think they get starker as we go on. I mean, I'm sure someone is reading your papers, but just for the purposes of this talk, no one is reading your papers. So I have, to be honest, I have. This is a general point. I know that there are stories that go around from civil servants, complaining that researchers email them with scientific articles as if they would read them, as if they were academics who would be interested. Not. But this is a more general point, which is that by necessity, policymakers have to ignore almost all evidence that might be relevant to their responsibilities. And so essentially, the responsibility of a typical minister is far more than they can process. So they have to ignore most issues and most information about them. And we talk about two kinds of shortcuts they might use. One is the identify goals, through things like manifestos, policy documents, and then they try and work out who they trust, because one of the quickest ways to get information quickly and routinely is to rely on a small number of trusted sources. So I think that's, one kind of strategy is to become that source of trusted information. And then the second shortcut that people use is, their gut instinct, their habits, their emotions. They make really quick decisions based on their beliefs. And so sometimes I think, depending on what you read, sometimes those are called cognitive biases. They're described as negative things that we have to do something with. Sometimes they're called fast and frugal heuristics, which are described as, remarkably efficient ways to gather information. And I think regardless of how we describe them, I think one of the kind of lessons is to try and work out how we can share information in a way that fits in with the shortcuts that policymakers would use to process that information, rather than simply assuming that, we're filling more and more gaps, or, we're reducing uncertainty with longer and longer papers. Okay, so I think that's the most inconvenient truth of them all, that I think as researchers, our incentive is to produce more and more information, when really as providers of something valuable to policymakers, we should be finding ways to provide less and less information. Okay, number 3. No one knows how policymaking works. So I teach a master's in public policy, and we spend a year where the first question at the first session is, what is policy and what is the policy process? And the answer is, I don't know. And then we end the year, I think I asked them again, and the answer is, I don't know. And the difference is that by the end of the year, students know what they don't know, which is, I think it's the closest we can get. So there are two ways I think we might try and picture that kind of process. One is on the left, this is a classic description of how policymaking could be described in the abstract if you break it down into essential functions. So the left-hand side is the kinds of things that governments need to do or look like they're doing. So often a government will put up this policy cycle to project what it does rather than actually describe accurately what it does. So, the functions are, it has to pay attention to and define problems, then it has to generate feasible solutions, and then it has to find a way to make a choice and legitimize the choice, allocate resources, implement, evaluate, and such like. So these are functions. And then I suppose the interesting thing for me is the example of a kind of complex image. This is produced by the same unit of the European Commission that also produces the image on the left. So they present two different images of policymaking in the same unit. One is this cycle, and one is this mess. And I think what they're essentially trying to project this difference between a simple image of how policymaking could be broken down into functions versus how it all looks when it's in practice. And if you try and follow those arrows, they're really just metaphorical arrows. They don't actually describe any kind of process. So I think the point there is, imagine you are trying to find ways to anticipate how to provide evidence within a policy process. If policymaking looked like the image on the left, there would be very clear opportunities to provide evidence to help define problems, provide evidence to help generate solutions, and then provide evidence on the evaluation process to see what worked and what didn't. Okay. If it looks like the process on the right, it's very difficult to know how you would you would engage and who you would try and speak with and when and why. Okay. Right. So, Inconvenient Truth 4. There's, as far as I know, I could be wrong, there's no solution to this problem. So actually, this is me trying to ward off a lot of questions along the lines of what should we do? So my answer is I don't know, or I know what to avoid. So I think there's a quite a common breakdown that comes from this this paper in 2010 by Best and Holmes, and they describe three different ways to think about evidence and policy uh, strategies. And I think we know most about the one to avoid, and that's what they would call the linear approach, which is essentially produce your research first and then send it out to someone later as if they would read it. And it is, I suppose the irony is, it is the most criticized approach to providing information, but also still by far the most used. You know, so when Catherine Oliver and colleagues try and survey initiatives, they're still finding, I think it's over 70% are, you know, fit that linear approach. As if people could produce research independent of policymakers and then interest them in it later. So we know less about the thing described as how to do it better. So I think increasingly people are talking about relational approaches to providing information. And so that is, you know, there's a very solid logic, which is if you were to form a non-trivial relationship with a relevant policymaker, you would be able to work out things like what are their beliefs, how do they think about policy problems, what kinds of information are they looking for, when is it most useful to them, and even, you know, how many pages would they read? That's the question I want to know. How many pages? Is it one or two, or is it half? We know it's not 100. Okay, so those questions. So we know less about this, I think, because if you go back to that image of the pulse process I gave you, I'll go back to just to save the bother. So if policymaking looked like the thing on the left-hand side, you could imagine there was one audience for this stuff. It would be easier to identify who to speak to, who to try and influence. But if it looks like this right-hand side image, it's not clear with whom people should be trying to form relationships. So I spend a lot of time in, you know, policy process studies trying to work out who's making decisions where in a political system and where responsibilities are spread across lots of different venues. As soon as you accept that, I think you accept it's not entirely clear who you would be best trying to form relationships with. Then the third one is we know least about the highest level aim. So I think people talk about this idea of treating evidence and policy relationships as some kind of system. And so people will use, they'll even talk about an ecosystem. And as far as I know, we have never gotten beyond the use of system as a metaphor. So sometimes people will try and picture what these relationships look like, but they tend to largely be a list of organizations that might be relevant and a bunch of arrows that just connect everyone. And that's the system. So I don't think we've got any further than that to say, okay, we recognize there are lots of different relevant relationships here, but it's very difficult to know what to make of that, you know, what to make of an image if you draw it, or how it changes how you would go about it. And then finally, I think this is my number 5. One solution to this kind of uncertainty could be what we call knowledge brokerage. I should say I put it in quotation marks because I noticed in some fields, knowledge brokerage is just an increasingly accepted term to describe a wide range of activity. But I think some people don't like it and they prefer different terms. So I think I noticed the Chief Science Advisor to the UK government, I think recently said, you know, I'm more of a knowledge mobilizer than a knowledge broker, right? Now, whatever term you want, I don't really care what people call it. I just know that it's not going to be a solution to any of these problems. Because I think when you get into what is involved in knowledge brokerage, what you really face as a knowledge broker is a series of unresolved dilemmas rather than a series of tools that you can use to save the day. Okay, so I've just given you a brief list. If we had, if we had hours, I could give you more, but I think this is like the top 7 dilemmas. The first one would be, what kind of brokers do we envisage? And I think sometimes people are brokers for governments. Okay, the government asks an organization or a person to help them find people to give them information. So, and then they might generate things like areas of research interest or something like that to help connect government to potential researchers. The other kind of broker, I think, works for a university or research organization, and they're there to help translate research insights into more usable policy. And they kind of seem the same, but they're very different roles in terms of the perspectives and the rules they follow, to the extent that you can have this community where there are knowledge brokers talking to other knowledge brokers. And they might get on, they might form a good relationship between each other. But I think maybe the better relationship they have, the more distant they are from their original clients. Okay, the second thing is what works in terms of knowledge brokerage. So I guess my role tends to, if you write these papers, my role tends to be to say we don't even know what that phrase "what works" means because it's not very clear what you would be able to identify as a measure of progress here. It's all kind of amorphous type activity. But but I mean, if you're looking for a more positive description, there are on websites like Transforming Evidence, there are attempts to try and pull together all these initiatives and work out if they have evaluated themselves, what do they say is working for them in their own context in terms of the things that they want. But a lot of this stuff are kind of process measures of success, a number of people spoken with, level of interest, that sort of thing, rather than, I guess something more tangible that you would associate with evidence and foreign policy. And then you've got resource allocation questions like in what capacity should you invest? So I think there's often doubt about should you invest money in professional brokerage positions, or should this be about capacity building in researchers themselves? And if it's in the researchers themselves, should you invest in fairly senior people who seem like a sure thing, or should you focus more on, equitable allocation and trying to support people who have lower impact just now? And then there's a question about, how you would use that capacity and what relationships should you invest, what level of government, what kind of person. Certainly, if I do interviews on this, often you find very quickly it's not politicians that you should be approaching. It is, it is people who actually process research for a living, and they tend to be more civil servant or officer type people. But then you face this dilemma where if you're able to form a relationship with a civil servant processing evidence, they're not too busy to do that, you're probably speaking with the wrong person, because you want to speak with the person who is too busy doing their job to speak to. Then the final, more kind of profound dilemmas would be whose rules do you follow? I can talk about this more if anyone's interested in the questions, but I think in a nutshell, I think your choice is you follow the rules associated with science advice principles, which is transparency, independence from government, speaking truth to power, all that stuff. Or you follow the rules of government. And certainly if you've studied the UK government, they're almost the opposite. They are secrecy, keep things in confidence, don't criticize the government, don't speak to truth to power, keep things behind closed doors and such like. And essentially, these rules do not complement each other. If you follow some of them, you can essentially, I reckon, follow scientific rules and be satisfied with your credibility among the profession, but not very influential. Or you can give up some of that credibility in the profession to be in the room with policymakers when they make choices. And I think you'd be very unusual if you could do both. And almost finally, what should drive you? So this comes up in kind of if you have to account for your progress. So there's some incentive to have a visible credit a visible impact on policy to justify the funding in your position. And that's very different from an incentive, which is to be influential behind the scenes, to do invisible work that you'll never get credit for. So there's different motivations there. One is essentially part of an accountability process. The other is part of a more informal process where you're trying to be influential by doing things that are very difficult to track. And then finally, this is my favorite question, I guess. Should research evidence really win the day anyway? So I think people start with this phrase, evidence-based, evidence policymaking, as if it's a kind of self-evident truth that policy should be evidence-based. I'm not so sure it should be. Okay. But that's okay, so I've run out of truths. Okay, thank you.
That's great, Paul. Thanks a million for that. You've covered quite a lot in a short amount of time. So so well done. I'm going to start going through some of the questions on Slido if that is okay. And you've certainly piqued the interest of some of the audience today by talking about, one way of trying to navigate the tsunami, if you want to call it that, of information, including but not limited to evidence, is that decision makers and policymakers will tend to default to a small number of trusted sources. So one of the questions from the floor is, what does it take to become a trusted source, so as that policymakers at least acknowledge, even if they don't use your
Yeah.
findings?
So, well, okay. Okay, I could waffle here. I'm going to try and keep myself in check. But I think there's two answers from uh, readily available research. The first comes from, I would say the most evidence to answer that question comes from studies of interest groups. Uh, and so I think this is a tricky thing for people, I think, in research who wouldn't see themselves very much in a comparable field. So we could call them advocacy groups, if people prefer. But interest group studies suggest that you become trusted insider by following the so-called rules of the game. So at least in kind of UK style systems where the rules are you can be part of a small, quite insulated policy community if you're prepared to do things that would keep you in there. And that would be you accept the legitimacy of government, or you accept the way they understand the policy problem. You make yourself known to be reliable, so you're providing information when they want it in a form they want it. You present modest demands. You are very reasonable in meetings. You don't criticize people too. So I guess that civil services are different, but I think there's this image of the UK civil service where even there are rules on who speaks first and how loud they are, that sort of thing. And then I guess the big one is you don't criticize the outcomes in public because then you won't be asked back in. So I think if those are the things you learn from interest group studies, then this presents quite a choice, which is, are you prepared to do that for the chance to be influential at some point? Because that's really just keeping you in the room. Or do you then go the other way, which is an outsider strategy, which is to be highly critical of government? And there, the aim is to recruit as many people as possible to your project to put pressure from the outside. So I think traditionally that's the choice from interest group studies. But at the same time, that kind of research suggests that following those rules is no guarantee of influence. It's what's the logical thing? It's okay, so this annoys me as a phrase, but it's a bit like you can't win the lottery if you don't buy a ticket. And of course, oh no, okay, I suddenly like that because it doesn't mean that if you buy the ticket you will win. Okay, so it's really just a way of being included to some extent. The second answer is with things like COVID, and again in kind of UK type experiences, the highest profile insiders were civil servants in science advice positions who were the conduit for uh, advisory bodies like SAGE and such like. So they were clearly um, relatively influential compared to most scientists because they had an official role in the government and they were prepared to follow the rules associated with that role. So it was that combination. So I think the most frustrated scientists on the outside were both not in those key roles or so frustrated with the process that they became more outsiders. So
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
okay.
Yeah, no, I think that makes sense and kind of resonates certainly here as well. I mean, maybe to continue on with that point, because you mentioned in your talk that in terms of the person who's ultimately making the decision, or a minister or otherwise is not going to be reading through all of this stuff themselves and collecting and having these conversations, but they're generally going to work through others, which are typically going to be civil servants in some sort of structure in the department as that conduit, both in terms of, perhaps collecting, as we find, pulling together maybe where the gaps are, where evidence might be needed, what type of information is needed, and at the other end, the output going back into those groups. So, somebody has asked, in terms of what you described as that kind of relational aspect of the process. Therefore, is it essentially kind of the permanent civil service in a sense that most of the time and the energy and whatever is best spent on, as opposed to, I mean, I'm always blown away by the number of scientists that write in to the minister and to the minister's office. So I'd be really, really interested in just unpicking that a little bit, following on
Yeah,
from your last point as well.
yeah. I mean, it's a tricky one because things are so up in the air. But certainly, I guess just logically, you're thinking the most senior ministers, if you look at their diaries, the amount of time they have to read information is tiny. I know I've got academic colleagues, they complain there's no time to do research anymore, that sort of thing. But I just don't see them having time to read research. So they are relying on a small group of people who will essentially do it for them, give them key points. So in that case, though, if it's clearly if people are looking for a political contact, often it's, like they're special advisors or something, or political advisors rather than civil servants. So I'm not entirely sure. I think that would very much depend on trying to work out what kind of people are their advisors. Are they, because there have been some very academic-y special advisors in some cases, but they seem exceptional. Like Mark Drakeford, who was the first Minister of Wales for a few years, he was a special advisor, and I think he had been an academic, so he was like the ideal audience for that stuff, but
Yep.
I think it's quite unusual. So then I think the probably the easiest win, as far as I can tell, is with the kind of analytical units within government who it's their role to gather, commission, gather, process information.
Mm.
So I think that's the obvious relationship. But I think the problem there, which I said a little bit, is certainly this is what one unit in the European Commission found. It's that they employed loads of scientists to do this kind of work, but they were very disconnected from people who are much more operational. So there's different roles within government.
Yeah.
So can form these relationships with people who process information, but they may be facing the same problems about connecting that information to people in process jobs. And I have once or twice have seen the kind of research that people in more time-pressed jobs do for themselves. And they're clearly not they're not doing stuff that would make you feel good about research. They're doing like it's like Google searches and that sort of thing. They're clearly not relying on their kind of trusted processes to find that information quickly. And I
Mm.
think there is this disconnect in terms of if you've been given a few days or a few weeks to come up with a report on something, uh, and you're under so much pressure, it's very difficult to then think about working with academics if you don't already know them and they don't already know the answer to your question because they've done the work already. They're looking for
Yep.
instant wins and And so I think that's the importance of these kind of relationships with more operational people, because at some point, and it could be tomorrow or it could be a year or 10 years, they're going to suddenly need information that you're relevant.
Hmm. Hmm.
So I think all of that's the idea of a window of opportunity. You form relationships speculatively with busier people in the hope that they'll remember you when they're looking for information.
Yeah, no, that's really interesting, Paul. And I think, in the context, a huge emphasis currently, which is why this topic, if I can call it that, is being so debated at the moment here in Ireland, because, government is taking a look at it, has just recently appointed a chief
Yeah.
scientific advisor, is looking at a civil service research network, and is really building and trying to expand those analytical units, as you call them. So certainly from a health research board perspective, and for many of our community, there is a research and evaluation, a stats and analytics, and a data and information team within the Ministry of Health. And certainly from a health research board perspective, in terms of either talking about agenda setting, evidence gaps, policy priorities, or so on, as that conduit between the research community, that's critical to us. I think the other issue that, and we will be talking a lot about that in the conference later in the year, with examples from other sectors as well, because this course is not unique to health. And I think also, post COVID, the context of, yes, talking about pandemic preparedness and
Mm.
response. I notice a lot more conversation in government, including with our Ministry of Health, around, let's actually agree perhaps what those, I'm going to call them, evidence hubs, trusted sources, avenues are in
Yeah.
peacetime, so as that we know what we're going to switch on in crisis time. So there's something really interesting about that, but not waiting always until we have a crisis to try and deal with some of those issues. So I think you've got the ball rolling nicely on that one. That will continue to snowball that one, and try and get into more discussion over the course of the year, and in the lead in to the conference. A couple of people have kind of asked a similar question in different wording, but they've picked up on your talk, where you're really talking about the uh, that you're not entirely sure that we should even be talking about evidence-based policy, and does evidence win the day, and is there such,
Mm.
if I can, I'm paraphrasing, is there such a thing really as evidence-based policy, and a couple of people wanting to know if you could elaborate a little bit on that, particularly in terms of what you mean by that, and what are the alternatives? Somebody asks, if it's not evidence-informed policy, well, what are the alternatives? So maybe if you just tease that one out a little bit.
Okay. Yeah. So I don't want to
Either
go too.
either ease their concerns, or
Yeah.
annoy them more.
Yeah. So I'll try not to be too annoying, but I mean, I suppose I wouldn't go too far in that. You. So it doesn't mean that I'm looking for evidence or uninformed policymaking. It was just that. So I think the kind of provocative point is these phrases, I think, come from researchers who start with evidence first, and then they try and work out how policies should make use of it. So there's a lot of so essentially a lot of research who feel like they have come up with something important, and they're not getting enough attention. And I think that's the why I would say, well, it's because you're focused very much on the research first, without trying to understand the policy process. So if if someone was to start in the opposite way and say, how does this policy process work, then there could be more realistic conversations about how evidence might fit in. And I guess you could call it evidence for informed, but it's such a, I think it means everything and nothing. So I think I'm so used to this. People use evidence informed often to signal that they recognize that evidence-based is not a realistic or particularly good phrase, but it really has meaning in relation to something else, instead of its own thing. So I think it's partly to prompt people to think about what they mean by it. The other thing might be, like, if you use the example of COVID, the alternative phrasing might be policy learning or something like that. So if the problem is we didn't get that right that last time, what can we learn to do better the next time? And as soon as you get into a phrase like policy learning, well, some of it is So one of the phrases that Claire Dunlop and Claudio Radielli uses epistemic learning. So, some of it is from experts, but most learning in policymaking is something else. So they use this phrase reflexive learning, which is lots of people with relevant knowledge share information with each other to try and understand something. So that's so I wouldn't call it evidence informed. I would say that's more collaborative learning from lots of people. The other one would be learning through bargaining, which is, part of politics is about learning how to win arguments and that sort of thing. So it's trial and error type learning.
Yeah.
And then, okay, so I've just published a preprint with a co-author this morning. If you like I like these doom type articles with big reviews where I say, okay, I've read it all and this is a problem. So this one is about learning about how to reduce inequalities associated with COVID. And I think there's this huge gap in the field where there are lots of people coming up with evidence on what the problem was and what maybe the government should do about it, but also a recognition that almost no government is going to use that information to do anything. And I think that's partly because the learning process is not really about a search for evidence like an enlightenment type process. It is something much more pragmatic and limited, and it is often the first thing that governments do when they learn is to rule out learning from certain countries. So, like I think one of the early points in COVID was the UK should learn from South Korea, China, Hong Kong, Taiwan about how they were much more successful. Uh, but you knew that they just wouldn't do that. They would just rule it out because they were such different systems. So I would go policy learning, but then I would instantly say it is not what it sounds like.
Very good, very good. Someone said that you're absolutely right that researchers are, I suppose, incentivized, perhaps in unhelpful ways. And they asked what reforms, particularly on the academic side, might help.
To be more engaged in this kind of stuff. Uh,
Yeah, I think so, and I suppose straddling, perhaps that space that you are
yeah,
between. I mean, you talked about, we're all humans, we all have a view, we're taxpayers, we're probably not as apolitical as we think we are. We're sort of specialists. We call ourselves the research scientists. So, so
yeah,
there's a lot in play in that space. So, perhaps what kind of advice or what do you think is helpful there, particularly,
yeah,
in terms of people from an academic perspective stepping into
yeah.
that arena?
I mean, I don't. I think probably if we're being kind of institutionalist about it, I think a lot of this starts with uh you know trying to work out how rules can facilitate more investment in this kind of time. So I know this is a big question for research funding bodies. We know that the incentives just now for a typical academic are to maximize their research income and their high profile publications. That's how you build careers, isn't it? And so impact on policy is often a kind of uh, far lower status. So I think the solutions that lots of funding bodies are trying to do is to provide far clearer rewards for impact than before. So the classic in the UK was the impact case study where suddenly a highly rated case study for impact had the money value equivalent to I don't know, half a dozen to a dozen articles or something like that. So suddenly the payoff was higher. And then I think the other route funding bodies are taking is to just oblige this kind of activity as part of the funding, which I'm quite. So I know this is kind of there are problems with this in terms of some researchers would see this as interference in terms of essentially being told what to do with and not being given independence. But if you're comfortable with the idea that public research funding is for public policy problems and that sort of thing, then I think that there are clear kind of obligations on academics that would, I guess, again, change their incentives, change what they're doing. And I think then, I guess, the hope is for some kind of generational shift where this just becomes a normal part of activity rather than something that other people do.
Yeah.
I mean, saying that, I know from just the experience of the UK system that although there are now incentives for a small number of people to produce these case studies, for most people, you you they're just not in a position to do it. So it's not like a professional change. It's essentially a shift in the rewards for certain people over other people. The classic winners and losers thing.
Yeah.
It's not panacea. And
Yeah.
I've been involved in big projects where there's an obligation to build impact into what you do. But for being honest, there's also a way of just coming up with a form of words that says you will do it, and then it's very difficult to track who did what, and because there's such a it's very unrealistic to expect visible policy impact from research anyway. Then it's not the same to track as scientific outputs.
Yeah, no, I can
So
attest to the fact it's challenging and so on. But certainly, from a HRB perspective, trying to get people to work with us on case studies and
yeah,
it's certainly very helpful first start. So we'd encourage people to keep doing that. But I think it is that dilemma. You reminded me in talking about knowledge brokers as well, because this is something that I suppose going right back to the sort of first sort of publications from Jonathan Lomas, and we had him across here in Ireland a long time ago talking to us about this, and intuitively it just seems to make so much sense when you say it out loud, but actually when it certainly as a funder in terms of thinking, well, what do we do in this space? What do we do? What do we encourage within grants? What can we incentivize? Or
yeah,
versus what needs to happen at more than an individual level and perhaps at a center or perhaps at an institution to institution level. For me, that dilemma of at what level, I know you talked about brokers within policy departments, brokers within research organizations. And for me, I also have the sort of a bit of a dilemma around sort of at what level and probably multi-level. I mean, would
yeah,
you say something picking up on your last point about, kind of when something becomes the norm
yeah,
and almost institutionalized, as opposed to just relying on wrapping around a small number of kind of impactful and more effective and maybe more resilient and
yeah.
long-standing individuals. Just anything that you would say, like if you were to, rather than being paralyzed by not knowing where to start, what would you say would be a good start in terms of looking at knowledge brokers and knowledge brokerage or whatever term people
Yeah,
do it.
I think that's always been this issue. Yeah, if you're an academic, you're just thinking, okay, I buy the argument, but no, no idea what to do. I mean, if people are working in universities and they ask that kind of question, then you say start with universities put on training sessions and that sort of thing to help people into that kind of thing. So I mean, I don't know. I'm a very insular, so I don't know what's the opportunities outside of universities. But that's a routine process now where they provide that partly because the university are incentivized to help people with that sort of stuff. And then uh, there I think there are specific schemes supported by funders to get some experience of politics or policy to see what how they would be relevant. So I know they're competitive schemes just like anything else, but they seem useful for people who I think like I mean the thing is they partly bother me because when people do the reports on them, they say I went in and I found out that things are very political and complex and fast paced and that sort of thing. I thought, well, there's probably easier ways to find that out, but it is good to have that supported experience. But I should say that it takes a remarkable amount of time and investment, I think, for this to become normal. Like I'm a small part in one initiative just now, and I would say, if you imagine you're 2 years in and thinking a lot still seem to be in the beginning, so it could be what 5 years in before they really feel that they're doing something that's been established. and then maybe the funding runs out and people move on. You know, so I think it's that issue about the. I think the large funders in the UK are thinking much more about the long-term infrastructure for this kind of work because they've recognized that a lot of their rules are not conducive to uh, anything that goes beyond 5 years.
Mm.
And I mean, this would be a real I think this is a really tricky thing with a lot of schemes. I think you won't be able to account for them in the same way. You know, with normal research schemes, you know, okay, this succeeded because they did this and they published that. Whereas after 5 years of an infrastructure project, you're thinking, oh, well, lots of people had lots of meetings. There was lots of collaboration, but I couldn't honestly tell you what I couldn't give you a tangible input onto what happened. So there's a lot of kind of it's like a leap of faith, I think, some of the stuff about
Yeah.
the
Yeah.
funding it. Yeah,
Yeah, no, a lot of what you're saying there is where the HRB are in the mode of reflecting and developing our new strategy to start in 2026. And I think this, in terms of both the what is evidence, what is good evidence, what is the right time for evidence, what is the right format, infrastructurally, things like the Evidence Synthesis Collaborative would welcome, what
yeah,
is rapid reviews, what can you do in a 1 week or two
yeah,
week turnaround time, and all of that throws up is certainly coming thick and fast in terms of the discourse that
yeah.
we're having around that. I mean, one of the questions asked is, if you were to describe what good research that can be presented to policymakers, or that they, what would that big question, a general question in a sense, but
Yeah.
like, is there anything that you would say? I mean, essentially, what information do policymakers most want? Is I suppose the
Yeah,
boom boom of the question asked. And what does that
that's
look
true.
like?
Yeah, so normally I would just waffle on that, but there's this really good article by it's the first author is Bates, and it was on this project called Trude with two U's, and essentially they interviewed over 100 potential users of evidence, and he asked them that kind of question. You know, what would you use? And of course, depending on who they had different requests. Because what they were saying was, you know, policymakers expect a certain thing, but we're also trying to give evidence to, you know, private businesses and that sort of thing, and they want to know essentially how will this help me make a profit? You know, why should I pay attention to it? So such a range. So I would say there's two parts. So in terms of what to project, one is this is sophisticated in terms of the expectations of the audience, which is different each time. And the other is this idea that it has to have some kind of meaning for them. I think there's a lot of focus now on trying to engage people's emotions, but I think it's much more about just trying to find out what frame of reference it would tap into that would make sense to them. You know, so sometimes that's personal stories or something like that, something concrete. But then I was trying to explore that recently and saying to someone, well, if that's true, is it the academics expected to come up, like go find personal stories to persuade policymakers with? I think the answer is no. I think it's just, they're just part of this process. It might be that public officials provide that kind of stuff, whereas academics provide information that performs a different role. So,
Mm.
well, anyway, okay, Bates, they waffle a bit less on that. So there is stuff on that. There's another in this. It's fresh in my mind because of this review that I was just talking about today, and the other one that's interesting is by Justina Bandola Gill. And now this is not. I don't read this to be um, enthused by life. Okay, just read it to see the lengths that organizations go to. So the description is of the lengths to which the World Bank and UNICEF have to go to make sure that governments will keep using simple measures of something. So in this case, it's measures of poverty. You know, World Bank, UNICEF have two different measures. And essentially, they have to go to remarkable lengths to make sure that governments are not embarrassed by the measure. Because if they
Mm.
use the
Mm.
measure poverty is too high or it lurches up, suddenly they see the tool as the problem. So even in really technical discussions, there's a remarkable amount of political investment required to work out what could go catastrophically wrong because the politics aren't right.
Mm.
So I think just two articles about just the kind of the wider contexts I find useful. And that's different from like the really basic stuff, which is I try and ask policymakers, what should people avoid doing? And it's the usual stuff like the sometimes researchers look kind of evangelical and superior. So don't go in being the big I am. That's probably the best advice, isn't it? Don't go into a meeting with policymakers and make out that there's something wrong with what they're doing.
Yeah, yeah, no, absolutely. I'm going to ask one last question, if that's okay. I can't see the rest of my team probably shouting at me behind the scenes, but Paul, because I suppose it follows on from that last conversation, and you've really wet the juices nicely now for our seminar series as it goes on. Like you probably get people ruminating on these things afterwards and asking even trickier questions to to others down the line, which is always nice. But I suppose one of the big changes that we're seeing from in research, I mean, we is that research is certainly from health and social care research, and not just at the HRB funds, has much greater public and patient involvement, has much more involvement at the start from the outside, even in
Yeah.
formulating the questions from sort of I'm going to call them sort of like decision maker or knowledge user organizations, or
Yeah.
has regular kind of contact or stakeholder groups all of the way through. And
Mm.
and I wonder, as a funder, I suppose I'm asking this, like, are we think we're onto something useful for this because you've talked about the relational aspect of it. You've talked about how politicians in particular want to,
Yeah.
they need to get that feedback, that view. They may do their own surveys, they may have their own independent kind of groups and so on. But I suppose my
Yeah.
question is it as useful perhaps as we think it is to build and integrate these elements and in a sense almost require them of a lot of the applied research that we do, particularly that hopes to have a pathway to impact in policy.
Yeah. So I think, I mean, it's a terrible phrase, but I think there are certain activities that tick key boxes when you're trying to project that your knowledge is relevant. And I think one of them is we didn't just produce this ourselves, we collaborated with a lot of people that you care about. So I think that's the sell with patient involvement, isn't it?
Mm,
You really care about patient service user information, views. So we have found a way to incorporate that into what we do. Therefore, it's more suitable for you, the audience. I suppose the thing at the back of my mind is this comes up more generally in terms of what role researchers see themselves as performing here. So I think for some, they see themselves as the overall coordinators of all their knowledge to be provided by government. So therefore, everyone's coming into their camp. They produce scientific research, but okay, they've got stakeholders, they've got advocacy, they've got service users, and then they present a whole package to government. And the other way to do it would to simply be one source of information for a government that does that. So that governments are going to be speaking with lots of different people for lots of different reasons, and so researchers fit into that process. And if we're finishing with being provocative, then I would say the first option is when you feel like you're really special, so you have to be in charge of it. The other one is when you just feel like you're making a contribution and you don't see yourself as special. So I think I don't think those are the two necessary motivations, but I reckon both are valuable, but I think the value of one doesn't undermine the value of another. There's still value to
mm,
simply providing information to policymakers when they ask for it,
sure.
than to say, okay, hang on, I'll better go and do a consultation as well, to make it work.
Mm, mm. Yeah, no, that's really helpful and really interesting to get your views on that. I'm sorry to anybody else who has asked a question that we haven't got to the table today. I've already gone a little bit over time. So we all have to get back to stuff in the afternoon. Paul, it really just holds for me to say thank you so much for taking up our invitation. We had invited Paul to the conference later in the year, but he wasn't available. But he very kindly offered to join us in any event and to stimulate, provoke, and get us thinking thinking about these issues, which in and of itself it means it's already been successful. And we will follow on with many of these thoughts with some of your people you've worked very closely with and debated these issues closely with, Paul, and indeed worked with over the next number of months. So please, you can't see the audience, but I'd like them to collectively give our thank you on their collective behalf now, and ask the audience, thank you for joining us today, taking time out to do that. And please do keep an eye on the HRB's social media channels and website for future dates and invitations to more interesting and stimulating events in this Evidence for Policy series. And remember to save the date of the 3rd of December for the conference later on in the year. So thank you very much. And Paul, thanks again from the HRB. Thank you.
My pleasure. Okay. See ya.
Thanks. Thanks a
Bye.
lot.